The first time I realized my parents could look straight through me without even blinking was on my wedding day, when the front row seats I'd reserved for them stayed empty, not because of an accident, not because of a missed flight or a sudden illness, but because somewhere in their quiet, carefully curated world, the idea of me getting married before my sister felt like a mistake they refused to be seen supporting. And when I stood there in my dress, hands cold, throat tight, pretending the garden breeze was the reason my eyes watered, I understood something that should have been obvious years ago. I wasn't a daughter to them the way she was. I was a detail, an accessory, a backup plan that wasn't supposed to happen first. I'm 32, and my sister Molan is 30, and if you asked anyone in our extended family to describe us, they wouldn't even hesitate, because the story has always been told the same way. Molan is the bright one, the effortless one, the one who enters a room and somehow becomes the center of it without trying, while I'm the quieter sister, the practical one, the one you don't worry about because I've never demanded anything, which sounds like a compliment until you live inside it long enough to realize it's just another way of saying you can be ignored without consequences. I used to tell myself my parents didn't mean to make it like that it was simply easier to celebrate a child who made celebrating simple, because my sister collected achievements the way some people collect souvenirs, and every time she brought home another trophy or another title it gave my parents a new reason to glow in front of other people, to stand a little straighter, to feel like their lives had proof of success hanging off the walls, framed and polished and impossible to argue with. Even in elementary school, she was winning things most kids didn't even know existed: spelling bees, science fairs, talent shows. And she didn't win in a way that felt lucky, she won in a way that felt inevitable, like the world had already agreed she was special and everyone else was just catching up, and my parents fed off it, not loudly, not cruelly in a way you could call out, but in a steady constant devotion that was somehow worse because it was so consistent you couldn't pretend it was temporary. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us wasn't just about grades or popularity, it was about the way my parents looked at her, like she was a future they could hold, and looked at me like I was a responsibility they assumed would manage itself. She was tall and slender in that way that makes people speak softly around you, like beauty should be handled carefully, and I was shorter, broader, built more like my mother's side of the family, which meant that when my sister started getting compliments, I started getting suggestions, and my mother's voice became this constant background soundtrack of improvement, like my body was a project she'd been assigned and didn't want to fail at. She signed me up for workout classes I didn't ask for, started buying healthier versions of foods I didn't even hate, and every time she said my sister never struggled with her weight, it landed like a verdict, not on my size, but on my worth, because in our house the unspoken rule wasn't that being healthy mattered, it was that being closer to Molan mattered, and the closer you were, the more love you received without needing to earn it. I learned early to laugh off comments that stung, because if you act like something doesn't hurt, people feel less guilty for doing it again, and guilt was the only thing that ever made my parents uncomfortable, which meant I got good at swallowing things before anyone could notice, and I became the kind of child who nodded and smiled, who didn't ask for more, who didn't make scenes, who tried to be so easy to raise that nobody could justify neglecting her, and the irony is that the easier I made it, the more invisible I became. When Molan got her first real modeling job in college, my parents threw a party. And I don't mean a small celebration with cake and a few relatives, I mean a lavish event with catered food and a guest list that felt like a campaign launch, where friends of friends showed up just to be part of the moment, and my parents beamed like her success was a reflection of their own, which in a way it was, because they wore her achievements like clothing. Her first professional headshot was framed and hung above the fireplace, front and center, the place where families usually put wedding photos or holiday portraits, and it stayed there like a permanent announcement of who mattered most in the house. And I remember standing in the living room one evening after the guests were gone, the smell of expensive perfume still lingering in the air, and realizing that no matter what I did, my achievements would never get that kind of space. The year I graduated with a degree in computer science, my parents congratulated me the way you congratulate someone for arriving on time, and my father said, "Good job," and my mother asked what Molan was doing next, and I stood there with my diploma folder in my hands, feeling foolish for having imagined, even for a second, that this would be the moment they looked at me and saw something they could be proud of without comparing it to her. I don't say any of this because I think my sister's life is easy, or because I believe success makes a person happy by default, because I've lived long enough to know that perfection is often a costume people wear until they forget how to take it off, but when you grow up in a house where one child is celebrated like a miracle and the other child is treated like a footnote, you learn to measure love in a way that turns even ordinary moments into quiet competitions, and you start doing things. Not because you want them, but because you want proof that you matter. For a while, I tried everything. I took the classes my parents recommended, joined the clubs they thought would build confidence, attended events I had no interest in because I wanted them to see me trying, and at one point, because the pressure to resemble my sister was so constant it started to feel like my only route to being liked, I even attempted modeling, which was honestly painful, not because I failed, but because I could see from the beginning that I was doing it for the wrong reasons, and when it didn't work out, my sister treated it like a joke she could keep on the shelf and pull down whenever she wanted to remind me where I stood. Eventually, somewhere in my mid-20s, I got tired in a way that wasn't physical, but spiritual, like a part of me had finally admitted that chasing love from people who rationed it was a form of self-harm, and I did something that felt almost rebellious. I stopped auditioning. I focused on my career because I actually liked what I did. I liked the logic of code and the clean satisfaction of solving a problem without needing applause, and I built a life that wasn't flashy, but was mine, with friends who laughed at my dry humor, with routines that made me feel steady, and with enough distance from my parents that I could attend family gatherings without letting their subtle worship of my sister reopen every old wound. At holidays, I'd show up, smile, nod, let them talk about Mullen's promotions and vacations and new relationships, and I'd leave before I got tired, because I'd learned that staying too long in a room where you're treated like background noise eventually makes you start believing you deserve it. Then, at a computer conference, I met the man who would become my husband. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just in the ordinary way real lives intersect, through a mutual friend, in a crowded hallway, while I was holding a coffee I didn't even like, and he made a joke that was stupid enough to make me laugh. He noticed me in a way my family never had, not like I was something to be evaluated, but like I was a person he genuinely wanted to know, and over time, in 100 small moments, he proved that he wasn't interested in fixing me or reshaping me or comparing me to someone else. He liked my mind. He liked my humor. He liked my body. He never once suggested I should be different to be loved, and the first time I realized how rare that was, it made me cry in the shower like grief was leaving my body through warm water. We dated for 4 years, and those years were quietly healing, not because they erased what I'd grown up with, but because they gave me a new reference point, a new normal, where love was consistent and safe and didn't disappear when I stopped performing. When he proposed, it was at home, just the two of us, with takeout containers on the table and our favorite show playing in the background, and it was so simple and so sincere that I didn't even care that there were no pictures, because for once the moment was ours, not a performance for anyone else. And when I called my parents to tell them I was engaged, I waited, stupidly, hopefully, for the reaction every daughter expects, the warmth, the excitement, the sense that I was finally stepping into a milestone they'd want to celebrate. Instead, there was silence. Not shock, not confusion, just stillness. My mother asked if I was sure I wanted to jump into this, and then, as if she couldn't stop herself, she suggested I might want to get in better shape before the wedding, like my body was still the most relevant thing about me, and my father barely spoke at all. Later, at my engagement party, they spent most of the night hunched over my mother's phone in a corner, and my husband, who didn't know my family's patterns the way I did, found it strange enough to mention, and then he told me something that made my stomach drop. He'd overheard them whispering to Mullen on the phone. She was crying. And my parents were trying to comfort her. They kept saying things like, "This wasn't the plan," and "We didn't expect her to do this first," and in that moment, something inside me went cold and clear, because I finally understood that my engagement wasn't just news to them, it was a disruption, an unscripted event in the story they'd been writing for years, where my sister was always the main character and I was always somewhere in the background. And from that point on, whether I admitted it to myself or not, I knew my wedding wasn't going to be the day I became part of their pride. It was going to be the day their image cracked. And I just didn't know yet how far they would go to pretend it never happened. After that night, after the realization settled in my chest like something heavy but undeniable, I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that years of quiet disappointment had trained me to expect rejection even when it wasn't coming, and that maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time my parents would surprise me, show up, choose me in a way they never had before, because surely a wedding was different. Surely it crossed some invisible line where even favoritism had to stop. I wanted to believe that. Wedding planning has a way of exposing who stands with you, not through grand gestures, but through the small, unglamorous moments. Who asks how you're holding up, who remembers deadlines, who cares about the things that matter to you even when they don't understand why they matter. My mother didn't ask. She had already created several Pinterest boards for Molin's future wedding, even though my sister wasn't engaged, and when I mentioned venues or dates, her responses felt distant, distracted, like she was indulging a temporary hobby rather than helping plan a life milestone. When I asked her opinion on locations, she said she trusted my judgment, which would have sounded supportive if it hadn't come from the same woman who had opinions about everything else in my life, especially my body. Choosing my dress should have been one of those moments I'd imagined since childhood, not because I dreamed of a fairy tale, but because I wanted to feel beautiful without qualifiers, without comparisons, without advice disguised as concern. I chose a simple A-line gown, understated but elegant, something that made me feel calm instead of exposed, and when I showed it to my mother, she looked it over with a critical eye and said, "It's practical for your figure," as if beauty was still something I needed to earn through compromise. I nodded, because that's what I'd always done. But later that night, alone in my apartment, I cried, not because of the dress, but because I realized I was still hoping for her approval even after telling myself I was done chasing it. My future mother-in-law noticed what my parents didn't. She asked questions. She showed up. She offered help without conditions. She went venue scouting with me, helped finalize details, listened when I talked about things that mattered to me even if they weren't impressive, and treated me like someone whose happiness was worth effort. The contrast was painful. Not because she was doing too much, but because she was doing what parents are supposed to do. Before sending out invitations, my husband and I double-checked everything, partly because I'm detail-oriented by nature, and partly because some part of me wanted to eliminate every possible excuse for absence. We sent both electronic and physical invitations. Delivery confirmed. Read receipts visible. Weeks passed. My parents didn't RSVP. I waited longer than I should have, because confronting the silence felt riskier than enduring it. Eventually, I called. No answer. I texted. Polite replies, vague explanations about being busy, about needing to check schedules, about getting back to me soon. They never did. I told myself not to spiral, not to assign meaning too quickly, because wedding planning consumes enough emotional energy without adding imagined betrayals, and I had enough to manage already. But as the date got closer, the absence stopped feeling like oversight and started feeling like a decision. At the bridal shower hosted by my husband's sister, surrounded by laughter and warmth and women who welcomed me without hesitation, the missing presence of my own family hung in the air like something everyone noticed but no one mentioned. No one asked where my parents were. No one needed to. The wedding day arrived gently, the way some days do, without drama, without warning, just sunlight and quiet anticipation, and for a few hours, I allowed myself to be present, to focus on the love I was building rather than the love I'd never received. The ceremony was held in a garden, early in the day, the kind of place that feels suspended from time, and as I walked down the aisle, I could see the front row clearly. 2 empty seats. They looked deliberate. I felt it most when the music shifted, when the moment for the father-daughter dance arrived and quietly passed, unacknowledged, because there was no one to step forward, no explanation needed, no announcement made. Just absence. It was a small wound compared to everything else I'd endured growing up, but it cut deeper because it was public, because it was permanent, because it marked a moment that could never be redone. Despite that, the day was beautiful. People smiled. People cried. People told us we looked happy. And we were. But happiness doesn't erase grief, it just makes it easier to survive. After the honeymoon, when life slowed enough for unanswered questions to surface, I finally reached my parents. This time, they answered. My mother sounded hurt, almost offended. She told me they were deeply upset that they had never received a formal invitation, that they felt excluded, overlooked, pushed aside. As she spoke, something in me tightened. I checked the records while we were on the phone. The invitations had been delivered. both kinds. To the same addresses they'd had for decades. I could have confronted her. I could have pointed out the lie. But years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I apologized instead. I hung up. It was my husband who said the thing I hadn't allowed myself to think yet. They didn't miss your wedding by accident. At first, I resisted that conclusion, because believing it meant accepting something final, something ugly, something that couldn't be explained away by miscommunication or oversight. But once the thought took root, it connected everything. The silence after the engagement. The lack of interest in planning. The whispered phone calls to Molan. The excuses. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen not to be there. And when I let myself see it that way, a quiet clarity settled in. It wasn't that they didn't love me. It was that loving me openly would have disrupted the image they'd built around my sister, the narrative where milestones happened in a specific order, where success followed a script, where my role was to wait my turn quietly and gratefully. I had broken that order. Months later, news reached me through family channels I barely participated in anymore. Molan was engaged. Suddenly, my parents were alive again. Excited. Proud. Energetic. They talked about upscale venues, designer gowns, private fittings, all the things they'd shown no interest in when it was my turn, and if I'd heard it years earlier, it would have crushed me. Instead, it made something shift. Then invitations started getting declined. At first, it was subtle. Excuses. Scheduling conflicts. Vague reasons. When relatives asked me why my parents hadn't attended my wedding, I told the truth, calmly, without drama, without exaggeration. They couldn't handle that. My parents accused me of sabotaging my sister's wedding out of jealousy. But I wasn't doing anything. I was just no longer lying for them. And that, apparently, was enough to make their carefully constructed image start to crack. At first, I tried to stay out of it. The rumors, the tension, the sudden fractures in a family that had always prided itself on appearing unbreakable, I told myself none of it was my responsibility, that I had already said everything I needed to say simply by refusing to lie anymore, and that whatever consequences followed belonged to the people who had spent years choosing appearances over honesty. But my parents didn't see it that way. They began calling. Texting. Leaving messages that carried the same accusation dressed up in different words, that I was jealous, that I was bitter, that I was deliberately trying to ruin my sister's wedding because I couldn't stand the idea of her having something bigger, more beautiful, more impressive than what I'd had. Hearing that, after everything, did something strange to me. It didn't hurt the way it once would have. It clarified. So I agreed to meet them. Not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I finally understood that closure isn't something other people give you, it's something you take when you're ready to stop waiting. We met in a quiet place, neutral ground, and almost immediately the conversation turned sharp. My mother accused me of spreading stories. My father sat stiffly, nodding along, offering small corrections meant to soften her words without actually challenging them. They said I had always been insecure. That I had misunderstood their intentions. That I was exaggerating. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to defend myself. Instead, I took a breath and said something I had never said out loud before. You're right, I told them. I am envious. They leaned forward, ready for victory. But not of her career. Not of her appearance. Not of her wedding. I paused, because some truths need space to land. I'm envious of the love you gave her so freely. The support you never even tried to give me. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, and revealing. My mother recovered first. She said I was rewriting history. That they had treated us equally. Something inside me finally broke, not in anger, but in release. Years of memories surfaced, not as accusations, but as facts. I spoke about birthdays overshadowed by my sister's achievements. About the high school graduation dinner that was cancelled because Molan had a modeling callback. About watching them plan her imaginary wedding for years while showing no interest in my real one. My father tried to interrupt. I didn't stop. I told them how it felt to stand at my wedding, staring at 2 empty seats, realizing that even on the day I chose a life partner, I still didn't matter enough to be publicly supported. When I finished, my mother asked a question that told me everything I needed to know. Why didn't you speak up if you felt this way? As if I hadn't spent my entire childhood trying. Then she said it, the sentence that closed the door forever. We never imagined you'd go this far to ruin Molin's wedding. We always knew you were insecure. In that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They weren't listening. They never had been. Their fear wasn't about losing me. It was about losing control of the story they'd built around my sister. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize. I simply said goodbye. Walking away felt different than I expected. There were tears, but they weren't frantic or desperate. They were quiet, steady, the kind that comes when you finally stop pretending. A few days later, my sister reached out. Her message was carefully written, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. She accused me of being inappropriate. Of being insecure. Of trying to destroy her happiness. I didn't reply. I blocked her number. That should have been the end of it. But when control is something you're used to having, losing it feels unbearable. So she contacted my husband. She framed it as concern. As family loyalty. As an attempt to help. She suggested that he had a responsibility to guide me, to manage my emotions, to make me see reason before I caused irreversible damage. Then she added something that revealed everything. That maintaining good relationships with successful family members, like herself, could be beneficial for his future. When my husband showed me the messages, we laughed, not cruelly, but in disbelief. Her assumption that status could replace sincerity, that influence could replace respect, that love could be negotiated like a transaction, told me more about her than years of competition ever had. His response was calm and brief. Thank you for your concern. My priority is supporting my wife's happiness. Please direct any further concerns to her. That was it. No argument. No explanation. Just a boundary. My sister sent one final message, accusing me of poisoning him against the family, warning that everything would fall apart. Then she went silent. Meanwhile, my parents scrambled. They called relatives one by one, trying to repair their image, claiming I had excluded them from my wedding, claiming I had played the victim, claiming I was jealous. But something had changed. People weren't believing them anymore. Stories surfaced. Patterns were recognized. Family members who had stayed quiet for years started speaking up, sharing their own experiences of watching favoritism play out, of noticing how often my sister was centered and how often I was overlooked. Invitations were declined. Support quietly withdrew. Not because I asked for it, but because the truth no longer needed protection. One evening, my husband found me sitting on our back porch, watching the sky turn gold as the sun set. They're never going to change, are they? I asked him. He squeezed my hand. No, he said. But you already have. And he was right. The child who tried to earn love is gone. The woman who stood in an empty front row seat and still said, I do, is here. I don't know what will happen with my sister's wedding. I don't know how far my parents' image will fall. And for the first time, I don't need to know. Because real family isn't built on appearances or rankings or perfection. It's built on presence. On choosing someone, even when it's inconvenient. And as painful as it is to accept that my parents will never be the people I needed them to be, it's less painful than spending another lifetime hoping they might change. Some stories don't end with apologies. They end with understanding. If this story felt familiar, you're not alone. Thank you for listening. This was Block Tales.